But I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight. I'd firstly like to thank Barnsley Civic Society for inviting me to do tonight's talk, and I want to extend my appreciation to the NUM for allowing me to do tonight's talk in this magnificent building. I don't think I'll be the first member of my family to stand here, because my great-grandfather, who was also called Joe Stanley, a miner at Rotherham Main Colliery, was victimised with trade union activity in 1910. His brother, my great-uncle, served as branch secretary of number 2 branch Parkgate branch number 2 of the Yorkshire Miners Association at Rotherham Main. And shortly after, my Stanley family moved to Grimethorpe, where in 1911 they simply recorded as living in Grimethorpe, Barnsley. At some point in 1914 they moved back to Rotherham, so if they'd have stayed I could have ended up being a Barnsley fan. Anyway, I hope you enjoy tonight's talk. So I want to start with this picture. This is one that me and Steve were talking about a little moment ago. It's from George Walker's The Collier, from his 1814 engravings called The Costumes of Yorkshire. And this is the only image that we have of a Yorkshire miner in the early 19th century. In the background you've got Middleton Colliery near Leeds, and you've got the Blenkinsop engine there, which is one of the early railways that was used to transport coal into Leeds. He's smoking a pipe, which was a common cause of explosions underground in the period, and he's carrying his snap to work in a basket there, you can see as well. Okay. So, we've got this map as well, which I'll explain in a moment. So, until the dispute of 1844, the West Riding Colliers strike was the largest instance of trade union activity in the region. Collieries from Leeds to Barnsley were shut down. Coal miners articulated their demands through the press, and they traversed the district, intimidating blacklegs and sabotaged pits, and miners were imprisoned. Despite the significance of the dispute, it's been relatively neglected by historians. John Baxter, historian at Sheffield University at the time, wrote an impressive thesis called The Origins of the Social War in South Yorkshire, but he asserted that little can be discovered about the strike, and that it was, quote, no more than a sporadic effort at organisation, and that it was short-lived. Fred Donnelly, a colleague of John Baxter, made one reference in his PhD thesis of the same year to a strike amongst the West Riding Colliers, and nothing more was said on the matter. Both of their dissertations, I believe, are in local studies as well here in Barnsley. Similarly, Fred Kajage, not a colleague of Baxter and Donnelly, but one of E.P. Thompson's doctoral students, he wrote a great PhD called Labour in Barnsley 1816 to 1856, which is definitely in the local studies library and available online as well. He wrote that trade unionism and industrial action is known to have taken place at some Yorkshire collieries in 1819, but add nothing else. In fact, nothing has been written since on the West Riding Miners Strike of 1819. So if we flip the slide, please. This is the extent to which it spread. You can see from Leeds up there all the way down to Barnsley in the south. So quite a large geographical area really of collieries being shut down. So why is it being ignored? Well, it's relatively minor in the scale of what's going off in 1819. I'll touch on that later. And also because it's very difficult to find anything about it. So in tonight's talk I want to sketch out the causes of the 1819 strike, to provide a bit of an overview of what happened, and then with some broader conclusion on how the strike fits into the context of popular protest and labour history. The strike was fundamentally different from those disputes that preceded and succeeded it, because it occurred at a time of bad trade, which ultimately explains why it failed. It took place at a time when the miners' standard of living had been eroded by widespread wage reductions and a dramatic rise in food prices. It's well documented in the scholarship that from 1816 onward, things got, for want of a better word, very bad for the working classes, and many coal owners reduced piece rates at their pits. So in this context, the rapid growth of miners' trade unionism in 1819 was a tool to mitigate the impact of economic distress. So Malcolm Chase, in his wonderful book called Early Trade Unionism, Fraternity, Skill and the Politics of Labour, argued that many trade societies were sympathetic to the revolutionary underground, But I've not found this to be the case of the Yorkshire miners in 1819. However, historian John Sanders, who recently published a great book that deals with textile trade unionism and popular politics, assures me that this can't be true. What I think is clear, however, is that the county elites and magistrates conflated industrial unrest with political radicalism, but in my view, there was no connection. Many of the letters in the West Riding Lieutenancy correspondence discussed the strike and the activities of radicals, but in my view, the miners' demands were based purely on improving their wages and living standards after years of attack on their piece rates. So, I'm coming to the handout now. So, before I go on, it's worth emphasising that I do believe there was a revolutionary underground in Barnsley in 1819. I've passed around some handouts which are transcriptions from some of the letters in the Harewood Lieutenancy papers in Leeds Archive. The Earl of Harewood, a Tory, was replaced as Lord Lieutenant of the West Riding when Earl Fitzwilliam, a Whig, was dismissed after he criticised the government's responses to the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester in 1890, when pro-democracy reformers were charged, sabred and ultimately murdered by the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry. You'll be able to see from some of the letters that one Barnsley linen weaving master, Joseph Beckett, was obsessed with finding out what the radicals in the town were up to. He wrote, "No town, Barnsley, is more radical than this town, nor worse protected, nor more in need of an antidote to the spreading poison." In April 1820, the Barnsley Weavers, led by William Constiff and Richard Addy, rose in rebellion and marched to Grange Moor, where they expected to meet up with the Huddersfield radicals. Unfortunately for the radicals, the authorities knew what they were up to, and they were quickly arrested by dragoons, or they fled. 22 were tried for high treason, sentenced to death, and their sentences were commuted to penal servitude in Van Diemen's Land. I can talk a little bit more about Barnsley radicalism at the end if anyone has any questions. Anyway, we'll go back to the miners. So, the attack on piece rates seems to have ramped up a gear at the start of 1819. We have some evidence from a colliery in Sheffield. At Burleymore Colliery, Robert Nightscale's fortnightly wages declined from £1.16 in February to £1.13 by July. Across the same period, the amount paid for end heading was reduced. In February, this was 2 shillings paid per yard. By July, this had been reduced to 1 shilling 10 pence. In April, the Rotherham coal owner, Mr. Kent, sold his collieries by auction. Despite them being at a convenient distance from the River Don, no markets for coal could be found. By October, the Barnsley coal owner, Samuel Thorpe, complained that the stagnation in trade had caused him to reduce the hours of his colliers. And he wrote, "I cannot dispose of any coals by water. The colliers employed about half work. I am obliged to make up some way for a living for them. I never had such a large stock of coals as at present, and I hope we shall be set at liberty soon." It's in this context of low wages and short time that the Yorkshire miners organised on a degree hitherto unprecedented. John Rule, a historian of early trade unionism, his assessment that 1819 was a bad year, which witnessed dramatic short-term increases in unemployment amongst industrial workers, is near the mark. Moreover, the cost of living in the region had increased dramatically. William Leake, a Barnsley weaver, spoke of the rise of the price of foodstuffs in 1819. Flour had risen from 1 shilling 6 to 3 shillings per stone, potatoes from 3 to 8 per peck, and meal from 1 shilling 2 to 2 shillings 6 per stone. Like 20 years earlier, 75% of earnings in this period were spent on food in 1819 to 20, and the average price of wheat stood high at 74 shillings 6 per imperial quarter. So undoubtedly the reduction in wages and the increase in the cost of living further eroded the colliers' standard of living, and it's in this context that the miners took strike action. So I'm aware you'll not be able to see that at the back. But the trade union that coordinated the strike in the winter months of 1819 was formed at Middleton near Leeds on the 1st of July in the same year. And remarkably, and that's what the picture is on the slide, the union's printed rules have survived. I think that this is the union which organised the strike because in December, at the height of the dispute, A Yorkshire coal owner wrote, about 6 months since, a combination was begun amongst the colliers. And from July onward, it seems that the union was gradually able to exert its influence and extend its membership southwards from Leeds to Barnsley. The first reference to a strike emerged in early November 1819. Several threatening letters were sent to coal owners across the region, warning them of a strike if they did not increase wages. The winter of 1819 was uncommonly severe, and for the colliers in employment, this may have helped strengthen their bargaining position. The following letter was sent to Timothy Wheatley, a coal owner at Mirfield, and it's the first letter I've found from the Yorkshire miners themselves and that articulated their demands through the press. I'm not going to read it all out, but I'll read you just the most important section. Sir, should any proprietor or workman be prejudiced through your refusal to take the counsel, your men will be taken from you immediately. But, on the contrary, should you feel disposed to concede what we desire, which, by the by, will be a temporary advantage to yourself, and show a disposition really felt to behave well to your workmen in case of turnout, which, in a future day, as it relates to yourself, will inevitably come to pass. A case, like the present, will be maintained, that none shall derive any advantage to your prejudices or at your expense, by order of the body of coal miners. We don't know whether this letter had any effect, but we can be more certain that the strike began on Friday, the 20th of November 1819, because the Leeds Mercury reported how the master colliers in this neighbourhood have determined to dismiss their men this day for the purpose of breaking their union. It is stated that the miners have bound themselves together in payment of a weekly sum to support any of their body when thrown out of work under certain conditions. On the same day, John Margison was committed to York Castle for 3 months for enticing his fellow workmen at the Flockton Colliery into an illegal combination called the Colliers Union Society. 3 days later, on the 23rd of November, 12 colliers employed by Messrs Chester & Co. were arrested and transported to the House of Correction at Wakefield for not giving the required 3 months' notice under master and servant law when terminating their contracts. As they passed through Batley, headed by a band, one correspondent wrote, they were hailed as martyrs and were accompanied to the House of Correction by hundreds of people with a band and music at their head. During the course of the procession into Wakefield, a Mrs Naylor died, so the paper claimed, of a burst blood vessel in the head occasioned by a fright. Joseph Beckett, the Barnsley weaving master, stated that she died of shock as she thought the advent of the noisy colliers was the impending rising of the radicals. At the end of November, the coal owners met at the Yew Tree pub in Roberttown, where it was resolved to discharge every man in the work that would not deliver up his union ticket, and to engage work at the present prices for a period to be fixed, engaging at the same time to give proper notice before he left work. So the Wakefield and Halifax Journal noted that a general dismissal took place in consequence, and all the mines in this district of the county were shut up. Most of the workmen yet stand out, but some have announced to their masters their willingness to submit. At Marston, I'm not entirely sure where that is, a coal owner, Mr Ward, offered to increase his colliers' wages in line with other pits in the district if they would go quietly to their work. The miners refused. On the 25th of November, the Colliers Union demonstrated its numerical strength through a demonstration. Around 8,000 colliers paraded through the streets of Leeds, accompanied by 6 bands of military music. The bands collected in East Parade and played the patriotic songs of Rule Britannia and God Save the King, and after doing so, this immense assemblage quietly dispersed. As historian Katrina Navikas has shown, through numerous examples, the singing of patriotic songs was an overt expression of loyalism from the labouring classes. The fact that the miners chose to sing Rule Britannia and God Save the King highlights that the miners wanted to make a public spectacle of their loyalism. The same week, the union publicly issued their demands through the Leeds Mercury. A declining living standards framed their demand for higher wages. Should it be asked what wages are required by the workmen, we answer 5 shillings per day of 8 hours for a man, and for a boy from 12 to 18 years of age, from 1 shilling to 2 shillings and sixpence per day of 8 hours, which it can easily be proved is no more than they had 18 years ago. No collier is able to earn above 2 shillings sixpence per day of 8 hours, which must be considered by all impartial judges quite inadequate to supply all their temporal necessities, considering the many disadvantages, inconveniences and misfortunes which frequently occur by reason of fire and water, tending to retard the labour of the workman and making a considerable deduction in his weekly earnings. And, owing to the reduction which has taken place in the price of getting coals within these last 18 years, a boy from 12 to 18 years of age now earns less than 1/3 than he did then. Considering the high rate of provisions these late years, what must have been the distressed situation for those families who have had to earn a scanty pittance under these and many other distressing circumstances, such as an advance in house rent, assessment, the expense of tools of various kinds, beside other misfortunes common to all men in the course of divine providence. Should any coal master allege, they stated, that the miners had earned 5 shillings a day of 8 hours for a man, they would refer them to the earnings of the workmen for the last 12 months and highlight the fallacy of the owner's claim. We are firmly determined, the miners continued, that rather than labour and toil and pine for want of bread, with all our exertions in labour, that we will desist from labour and patiently pine and have no labour until we are more amply recompensed. The union demanded an 8-hour day for colliers. It is necessary, they stated, that the hours of labour should be restricted. 8 hours per day for a miner is quite sufficient to labour, and some particular cases too long. The miners disparaged those gentlemen who sit comfortably in their parlours, indulging themselves by the fire, and have every sensual gratification, while the collier is at the same time stripped naked, and with all his strength exerting himself to get a small pittance to supply his temporal wants. The union stated that the colliers were confined to 20, this is what's on the slide, confined to 20 or 30 inches in height, panting and sweating, more like a poor brute pursued by the hunters in some subterraneous cavern than a human being. He has no time for eating till his work is done, and then, in consequence of him being so long confined in his current situation, it is with difficulty that he can get himself erect, and thus he trudges home to his poor family, cheerful and happy, if he has been able to earn a moderate competency for their supply. This is sufficient, but alas, the reverse is too often the case, and especially has been these late years. On the 29th of November, the coal owners replied. They stated that the strike would inflict the serious privation upon the country. Such action, the coal owners stated, most imperiously called upon the coal masters to act in unison. It was clear, they continued, that unless the evil was met by promptitude and decision, the county must be compelled to submit to the most arbitrary and exorbitant price in one of the most indispensable articles of consumption. The miners' demands could not be agreed to, they stated, for the good of the public at large. Quote, a compliance with the miners' present demands would cause an advance in the price of coals from 2 shillings to 2 shillings sixpence per tonne, which it was obvious would amount to a prohibition of working the inferior coals which are used for steam engines, line burnings, and will bring incalculable distress upon the country. There are, moreover, many conditions which the miners wish to impose upon their employers quite as objectionable as the advance of wages, and to which it is utterly impossible for the coal masters to accede. The owners reiterated to the public how the miners were remunerated with high wages. Their earnings, they claimed, may truly be stated at 3 to 5 shillings per day. There are instances when a good workman can earn from 6 to 7 shillings per day, clear of all deductions. According to the printer's statement of prices sent in by the Union Committee, the coal owners continued, the colliers would regularly earn from 1 shilling to 1 shilling and 3p per hour whenever they choose to work. So far it is from the desires of the coal masters to deny their men a fair compensation for their labour that they may, without fear of contradiction, assert that no large body of workmen have so little reason to complain of the times as the colliers. Indeed, the masters hinted at the ineffectiveness of the combination laws, which were a series of anti-trade union laws enacted in 1799 and in 1800. A series of anti-trade union laws enacted in 1790 and 1800 in their public indictment of the miners. It has been asked of the coal masters, why suspend your works? Why not make an example of your men for entering into an unlawful combination to raise wages? The answer is the punishment awarded by the law for this offence would afford no relief, inasmuch as it would not dissolve the union. All the jails in the West Riding could not contain 1/3 of the union men, even if crowded to suffocation. And so far is imprisonment from being considered a punishment, in this case, quite hard to read, that it is viewed by these deluded men as a kind of triumph. And in the instances where it has been inflicted, hundreds of their companions have accompanied the prisoners to the jail with bands and music and cheering. After mature consideration, there appeared no other method effectually to meet the evil than for the coal masters at once to suspend their works until the men agreed to abandon the union. And pursuing this course, it is evident that the coal masters are advocating the cause of the country at large, and they may confidently add the true interests of the workmen also. At a very heavy loss and serious inconvenience to themselves, it is reasonably hoped that no improper motives will be imputed to them. In conclusion, the coal masters earnestly recommend all consumers of coal to be as careful as possible in the use of them, as the supply must necessarily be exceedingly limited until the great body of miners return to their sense of duty. Others outside the dispute joined in debating miners' wages. One correspondent to the Leeds Mercury, styling himself a resistor, declared that the miners should be abundantly satisfied with their late earnings because they've had from 21 shillings to 28 shillings per week at the rate of work of 8 hours per day for 6 days in the week. He recognised, however, that at the larger collieries in Yorkshire, which from the want of sales at a particular season are under the necessity of limiting their men in order that they may all have a share, and in such cases the average earnings do not exceed from 12 to 15 shillings weekly. He remonstrated that the miners' demand should be opposed, as it would advance the price of coal's full 50% to the consumer, and then leave the masses under the complete control of a set of men that know how less to govern than they know how to obey. Because the colliers would not deliver up their union tickets and withdraw themselves from the union combination, the dispute would become a trial of privations, he continued, where either the masters with their more ample means or the workmen, backed by the union societies, can hold on for the longest. On the 30th of November, the coal owners met at Dewsbury. From all that we have heard on the existing differences, the Leeds Mercury declared, we conclude that the advance asked by the workmen is enormous, but that the same information induces us to believe that some increase in wages is necessary, and a little relaxation on each side might lead to an amicable adjustment. The paper lamented the repulsive and unaccommodating nature of both parties, and added that we do not know how better to serve the contending parties and secure the country against starvation. From the Dewsbury collieries, it was stated that the union's demands were agreed to 12 cores of coal, that if the union's demands were agreed to, 12 cores of coal would advance from 6 shillings to 9p a penny, an increase of 50%. Indeed, the Dewsbury magistrate Michael Stocks, at a meeting of coal owners, stated that the advance of wages claimed by the workmen was unreasonable and inadmissible and should be steadily resisted. The impact of the strike was felt at the beginning of December. The Wakefield and Halifax Journal recommended that the inhabitants of this neighbourhood to be as economically as possible in the use of fuel, as there is the prospect of a long contest between the workmen and their employers, during which the supply, if not wholly stopped, will be very precarious. The newspaper clearly articulated its position on the dispute. Some few individuals may perhaps have had some cause for complaint, but the present demands of this discontented body are certainly most unreasonable. We observe, therefore, with satisfaction the determination manifested by the proprietors of the collieries to resist them. As they were to take effect, it would be highly pernicious to the trade of the country in general, and ultimately ruin even the workmen themselves. Some coal masters advertise for blackleg labour to keep their pits going, and this is what we've got here. I apologise for the quality, but it's taken from some quite old microfilm. It's the Wakefield and Halifax Journal, and it says paddlers, hammermen and balling furnacemen, colliers and ironstone getters, and then underneath it says, no workmen need apply who are members of any existing combination of union established for the unlawful purpose of controlling any trade or business, as to wages or manner of working or otherwise. I'll just have a drink. Indeed, on the 2nd of December, the bowling colliers stated their demands. The true cause of our dismissal from employment, they declared, was our employers required to sign a piece of paper which they presented, but the content of which, and this was really clever, they said, on the content of which we could not, on account of the technical terms and phrases used therein, sufficiently understand. So they unanimously refused to sign and were, as a result, dismissed from employment. Indeed, the bowling colliers also printed a correct statement of wages to demonstrate the inadequacy of what they were paid. And the best bet at bowling was stated that the miners earned 2 shillings 6pence per day, 17 shillings a week. And out of these wages, they have tools and candles to purchase from this pittance. They concluded, we have now, in a plain way if possible, laid before the public the rate of wages for which the mines have been lately worked. And we appeal to the public to say whether or not we are justified in demanding an advance, ere we return to the bowels of the earth, to be incarcerated for the space of 8 hours daily, without a moment's time for refreshment, liable to the most dreadful deaths at every stroke, and labouring in postures the most prejudicial to health. We demand no more than what a common mechanic is in the regular habit of receiving. The condition of the poor in this country calls for compassion and redress, and we sincerely hope that the benevolent and charitable public will not withhold that compassion from us, which we stand in so much need. So, to put this into some context, in 1811 it was reported that the colliers were earning £1 a week, and by 1819 certainly had been reduced to 16 or 17 shillings. And as we know, this decline in wages took place as the cost of living rose, so we can confidently conclude that by 1819 the miners' real wages were significantly lower than they had been 10 years earlier. So as the strike continued, the region's various coal loaders continued to refuse union men into the pit, and Joseph Beckett of Barnsley writes to Viscount Lascelles informing him, we have a coal miner here, an owner, who agents for Sir Thomas Gascoigne's mines. This man, aware of the combination at Garforth, and knowing that his men here were in the Miners' Union Club, which was formed to support the turnout colliers till their object of raising wages was obtained, this miner has, I say, got something with his colliers here, and would not allow them to descend until they had surrendered to him their union tickets. 2 of these tickets are just before me now, and got by this spirited measure. 7 more of them are in the hands of the miners, and the workmen do not give them up, and go on to work on the condition required. You would do well to endeavour to put an end to these unions. They make labour dear and enhance the cost of manufactured articles. Large meetings of colliers were held across the West Riding on the first week of December 1819. The colliers are in a ferment, John Carr of Wakefield wrote. On his way home last Saturday, I passed many who had been at Colton Moor near Temple Newsom, where nearly 400 had assembled, headed by a local preacher. They had not determined upon anything particular, but there would very soon be another meeting of all the colliers in this part of the country when something of purpose would be done. And he underlines that bit, that last bit, something of purpose would be done. But despite the numerous meetings taking place in the West Riding for political reform in the winter of 1819, there's no evidence that this was one of them. In all of the depositions sworn before the West Riding magistrates, and some of these are on the handouts that I've passed around, in the lieutenancy papers, none of them mention colliers participating in arming and drilling. Indeed, in the absence of any reference to colliers in the depositions, it indicates that the Yorkshire miners were not a key component of West Riding radicalism. Based on the evidence, the miners' demands were conditioned by the widespread distress resulting from progressively lower real wages and the rise in the cost of living. However, this does not preclude that the radical associations and the colliers' unions could have been organised on the same lines. A W. Herbert, I'm not sure who he is actually, not being able to find out, wrote to Lascelles, is another West Riding gentleman. Of course you are aware of the unceasing distress in this part of the country in consequence of the cessation of the colliers from work at this season of the year, in a view to advance wages. I am informed that the radicals in this neighbourhood make use of union tickets similar to those colliers, by which they agree to contribute a small weekly sum, and that their mode of recruiting is like raising a regiment. A certain number of tickets are left with an active, talkative fellow, and as soon as he has added 25 recruits to the union, he is declared their leader. In my humble apprehension, the organisation of the radicals has, in a great measure, sprung from the manner in which the colliers, manufacturers, and so on, have been permitted to combine for the purpose of enforcing increases of wages. For in the natural course of such combinations, if successful, will be extended to political objects. In my own mind, I am satisfied that the present system of contributory unions to force an advance of wages is the root of the present extended mischief. He also articulated concerns of a wider conspiracy with the miners of the North East coalfield, reflecting concerns about how trade unionism had spread in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. If those of Durham and Northumberland do not yet act in concert with them, the Yorkshire miners, it cannot be doubted that the time is not very distant when they will. And it was not until 1842, however, that the coalfields finally joined in one union. Around the 10th of December, a meeting of colliers, masters and magistrates was held at the Wakefield Courthouse to settle the dispute. Although the strike was not ended, the magistrates, and this is remarkable, were clearly of opinion that the combination of the masters to turn off, sack their workmen without any warning was no less illegal than that of the workmen to refuse to work unless their demands of an advance of wages was adhered to. In a remarkable turn of events, the magistrates used master and servant law and awarded all colliers who were illegally dismissed the wages they should have had if they had stayed at work. The Wakefield and Halifax Journal stated, "The magistrates therefore unhesitatingly awarded all of the men their wages for the fortnight during which they had been out at work. Some of the masters acquiesced so far as to receive their men back into work again and allow them to make up the time that they had lost with additional work, to which arrangement the men consented. Others expressed a willingness to take the men again into employment, but positively refused to make them any allowances for the time that they had lost. The magistrates, however, signed several warrants against the masters for these wages. We have heard, in some instances, amicable arrangements have been made between the parties, and a number of workmen have, in consequence, resumed their wonted employment." Some of the indictments issued to the coal owners for unpaid wages have survived. A certain William Scargill of Flockton received £1 1 shilling in unpaid wages, and a Jonas Barraclough received £4 4 shillings from Mirfield. The vast majority, however, received £2 2 shillings. Interestingly, John Goodare Jr., one of the colliers who received £2 2 shillings, was lately found guilty of intimidating a blackleg miner. So, the graphs on your slides here Generated from coal output records at Middleton Colliery in Leeds, and these are held in Leeds archives, demonstrate the impact on coal production and wage expenditure in the period immediately before and during the strike. And the strike ended in late December or in early January at the latest. Similar, this slide demonstrates the dramatic fall in wages paid at the colliery in the weeks of the strike. There's some evidence that blackleg labour was being used at the pit. Between the 2nd and 15th of December inclusive, £4.15 shillings was expended on wages for, quote, men not being colliers at sixpence, and £2.2 shillings for men not being hurriers. Indeed, during the period 18th of November to the 1st of December, when all the pits were in operation, there is no reference in any of the wages books whatsoever of those being employed in the pits as not being colliers or not being hurriers. So by mid-December, as this chart suggests, or the previous chart suggests, the strike cracked. It was reported in the Leeds Mercury that the Low Moor men have given up all of their union tickets and those collieries are proceeding as usual. The Flockton colliery is also at work again, and a number of men have abjured the combination. And at Middleton Colliery, the wage books, expenditure books, highlight blackleg labour was increasingly being used. At other works, men hitherto employed in this way are set to get coal, it was written, and many common labourers are earning good wages in this way. At a meeting of the coal masters, it was again resolved to adhere to the former resolution to break up the union societies. The miners remained resolute, however, in their refusal to give up the union tickets, nor to relax their claim for an advance in wages. And the generality of the collieries still remained at a stand. This state of things, the Leeds Mercury stated, cannot continue for long. Sir John Lister Kay, who owned the Flockton colliery, wrote to Lord Lascelles on the 20th of December stating that my colliers are all at work and laughing at those who struck. And he underlines this bit: such a measure will never happen again, for that they now find that the funds are not distributed to the seeders, consequently they are quarrelling with their treasurers, their leaders, and with one another. So acts of violence break out as the miners become more desperate. John Robinson, who I previously mentioned, and John Goodare of the Caldermaine Colliery, of Flockton Colliery, were both committed to York Castle for enticing colliers to enter into an unlawful combination and for intimidating others who were not in the union from working by using threatening language. Later, other individuals were found guilty of intimidation and were made to issue a public pardon. Nancy Brown, Ruth Brown, Mary Longley, Martha Bickerdike, Charlotte Hartley and Mary Fielding were all found guilty of obstructing William Broadhead from attending his employment at Reverend Wood's Colliery in East Ardsley because he was not a member of the union. So in 1819, as in later disputes, women played a leading role along with the men in supporting their trade union. So, after the dispute ended, George Arundel and Joseph Ashton of Alvethorpe were in prison for 3 months in York Castle for intimidating 2 working colliers, Charles Scholes and Richard Davis, on the 24th of December at the Fenton's Pottervins Plain Colliery. Indeed, to prevent blacklegs going to work, the strikers disabled collieries. At a pit belonging to Reverend Wood near Wakefield, the rope was cut through by some unknown hand and broke, precipitating a man and boy going to work to the bottom. At a meeting of the Colliers Union at Swillington Bridge near Leeds, it was determined to hold out to the last and not to submit to the masters. And the same night, considerable damage was done to the spouts at Thorpe Hill Colliery. The Wakefield and Halifax Journal declared that there was every reason to suppose that this offence was perpetrated by a number of the men now standing out for wages. The same week, an outhouse belonging to Sir John Lister Kay was broken into, and the carcass of a recently killed calf was carried off. On Christmas Day, working colliers from Lister Kay's Flockton Colliery assembled at Denby Grange and, in good ale, drank the health to the King and the success of the coal trade. Highly to their credit, it was stated, this respectable body of men have not struck work at any time, nor are they engaged in any illegal combination whatever. Although these men were not the striking miners, the drinking of the health to the king again hints at the loyalism of some of the colliers. The Wakefield and Halifax Journal subsequently stated how the persons taken to the House of Correction and the man being sent to York Castle for 3 months, the John Goodare Jr. that we mentioned, designated in the public papers of being of the Flockton colliery, have had no concern whatever with the above colliery or any of the collieries attached to it. Evidently, either Lister Kay or his colliers wanted to reject any connection to the union. So I had a look through the quarter session papers, and I did find that John Goodare Jr. was actually employed by William Stansfield and Joseph Child, and not by Lister Kay at his Flockton colliery. So the strike gradually petered out after Christmas. The Wakefield and Halifax Journal reported on New Year's Eve, "The Colliers' Union has, in great measure, been dissolved, and a great proportion of the workmen have already submitted returning to their work at former prices and given up their union tickets. A few staunch members, however, stayed out. It is not known when they returned to work. The strike failed because it took place at a time of depressed trade. Coal owners reduced wages due to the lack of demand for coal, and owners had no incentive to settle the dispute because the pits continued to be worked by blackleg miners desperate to earn wages when the cost of living was high. It was not until 1833 that the Yorkshire miners struck again en masse. When the colliers returned to work, the coal owners congratulated the West Riding Magistracy for their role in suppressing the union. On the 1st of May 1820, the coal owners of the West Riding met at the White Hart Inn at Wakefield. Next slide, please. Chaired by Jonas Clark, a Silkstone coal owner, the owners unanimously agreed to purchase a piece of plate for the Wakefield magistrate Michael Stocks for our great admiration of his conduct during the late disturbed state of the country, particularly during the dispute of the workmen employed in collieries with their employers under influence of illegal combinations and confederated union clubs. The masters described the miners' union as one of the most alarming and dangerous combinations that existed in this or any other country. The meeting was the culmination of 2 months' discussion about how to reward Stocks for his actions. Earlier in March, an anonymous correspondent from Dewsbury wrote to the Leeds Mercury to publicly thank Stocks for his prompt and decisive measures in suppressing the miners' union. This correspondent added that his actions have been attended with the happiest effects. Tranquillity is perfectly restored, they added. The union appears to be completely dissolved, and great numbers of its members have come forward to accept work on the terms offered by the masters. In September 1820, Halliday, accompanied by 3 other gentlemen, presented Stocks with a massive silver cup. The Leeds Mercury stated that the cup was presented for his services during a period of great insubordination amongst the workmen employed in the collieries. After he received the cup, Stocks replied, "During the late disturbances amongst the coal miners in the West Riding of the county of York, no one, I assure you, lamented more sincerely than their obstinate and ill-advised conduct than myself. Neither did anyone hail with greater pleasure the subjugation of that dangerous and illegal combination, which threatened alike destruction in great measure to the manufactures of this riding, annihilation to the authority of the master colliers, and ruin to the best interests of men. Gentlemen, it is not very surprising that a captivating yet delusive ideas of men becoming masters through the means of combination never defined, consequently omnipotent in operation, should be eagerly embraced by the miners." He was remembered for his role in suppressing the union for many years afterwards. To testimonial for him in 1830, a Mr. Oldroyd expressed his approbation of the conduct of Mr. Stocks during the turnout of the colliers and the clothiers in 1820. In the same year, Mr. Hinchcliffe bore similar testimony to Mr. Stocks' firmness during the turnout of the colliers. He added that he put an end to the union, which, if it had continued, would have been ruinous to the neighbourhood, owing to the increase in the price of coal occasioned by the high wages they demanded. He may have suppressed the 1819 union, but he did not, however, suppress Yorkshire Miners trade unionism. So, to conclude. In this paper, I've kind of charted the causes and events and the consequences of the 1819 Yorkshire Miners Strike. And John Baxter's assertions that there can be little discovered about the strike is incorrect. And similarly, both Donnelly and Kage seriously underestimate the significance of this strike. All these historians, however, miss the real reason why the strike took place at all. The Yorkshire miners' wages had declined while the cost of living had rose, and when compared to the war years, the Napoleonic War years, their standard of living was so much lower. Indeed, the repeated insistence of their demands that wages had been reduced and they could no longer make a living highlights the precarious position that the miners found themselves in by the winter months of 1819. The strike ultimately failed, but there can be no doubt that it was costly and lost sales for many employers. Despite apprehensions of elites that the strike was part of a wider radical nexus, there is no evidence for this. The strike was purely a dispute concerned with improving wages at a time when living standards had declined. Criticism of Peterloo or discourse advocating for the reformation of Parliament, despite loud calls for reform in the region, particularly in Barnsley, as your handout suggests, did not feature in the miners' demands. They were solely based on wages and improving living standards. And according to the depositions in the lieutenancy papers in Leeds, the total absence of any colliers during episodes of drilling and arming is further testimony to the fact that this strike had no connection to West Riding radicalism. However, as it says on the slide, I would very much like to be proved wrong. If anyone fancies finding some miners involved in arming and drilling, I would love that. And I'd very much like to know. So the early years of the 1820s were very similar to 1819. By late 1822, however, the coal industry was booming again, and the Yorkshire miners decided to take advantage of the favourable demand for coal and strike for higher wages at a time when the cost of living was declining. The strike of 1819 was instrumental in showing the miners how to organise collectively when under attack. How they got from the failure of 1819 to the very successful strikes of the mid-1820s and the early 1830s is, however, a tale for another time. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, an incredible amount of research there, isn't there? Absolutely fantastic for you to have uncovered that amount of detail of what was going on and what was being said at the time. So thank you so much for sharing that. But any questions? I'm sure there must be something you'd like to just find a little bit more about. Alan?
These were clearly very turbulent times in the area of West and South Yorkshire that you showed on the map. What was happening in the rest of the country, the other coal areas around that time?
So in the North East, again, the North East has a longer tradition of trade unionism going back into the the early 18th century. Yes, there was a series of strikes in the North East in 1818, but nothing in 1819. Also in Lancashire and Cheshire, because that coalfield is quite similar to Yorkshire in this case, kind of smaller collieries, mainly for local consumption. There's definitely unions being formed there. There's a great book by Raymond Challoner called The Lancashire and Cheshire Miners, and in that he talks about a lot of the strikes from 1816 into 1818, and in South Wales as well. There's an article written by a historian of Chartism called David Jones, and he looks at the strike in 1816. So you get a sense of, in all these emerging coalfields, that other unions are being formed, and miners are starting to articulate demands for higher wages. Yeah, and in some of those areas, particularly in the North East, it does tend to run in line with radicalism much closely. But we've not got there yet. We do find by the 1840s, Yorkshire miners are Chartists, and that's sort of something that I'm really interested in thinking about at the moment. But we're just not there yet in 1819.
This is a follow-on from that. What was the government thinking about all this?
Oh, they're absolutely horrified. They are sending spies and agents provocateurs into coalfields. They're looking at radicals and how they're connected. There's Lord Sidmouth, who's, how can I put this politely, he's a really, really nasty man. He's got spies all over sending him reports into what people are doing. The Earl of Harewood, Lord Lascelles, actually gets a bit fed up with Joseph Beckett, the Barnsley weaving master, sending him so many letters all of the time about, because he's obsessed with radicalism. He wants to know who all the radicals are, and he's got people spying on them, writing letters to him. It's essentially why Grange Moor is the catastrophe that it is, because there's no way that they could have succeeded because of the level of infiltration that the government had with spies writing about everything that's going on. Even though you think that the arm of the state was so small in that period, it was not. It was very, very good at finding out what people were up to through spies and networks. And there's evidence in 1817, some of you may have heard of the Pentridge Rising, where people rise in Derbyshire to try and set a provisional government up, and it's actually orchestrated by someone called Oliver the Spy, who is essentially Jeremiah Brandreth, who leads the Pentridge Rising in 1817. He's basically being encouraged by Oliver the Spy, who goes back to Lord Sidmouth and says, right, we've got some evidence now, you can hang this man as a traitor, we'll execute this man, yeah. And they hold his head up, behold the head of a traitor, after his head's been chopped off.
Is there another question here?
No, I think you've answered the question I was going to ask about what influence Chartism had on the disputes, and it was obvious that the Industrial Revolution was actually forcing the workers to demand what they were actually worth.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So certainly by the 1840s, the Yorkshire Miners definitely are becoming Chartists. I'm actually doing something. I actually wrote something because I'm like on the Society for the Study of Labour History about a Yorkshire miner called John Orty, who becomes a committed Chartist, and we know he's a committed Chartist because he calls two of his daughters, one Jane O'Connor after Fergus O'Connor, the leading Chartist, Jane O'Connor Orty, and his second daughter Anne O'Connor Orty. So we know he's a committed Chartist, and the Leeds Mercury actually described him as a Republican of the old school in one of his meetings. So you do get a sense of by the 1840s that the Yorkshire Miners are becoming Chartists and are becoming more part of Chartist meetings. So John Baxter's done a lot of work on this period in the 1840s. And Earl Fitzwilliam, not the fourth Earl, who's on kind of the Peterloo one, who got dismissed, the fifth Earl, he's again quite a nasty piece of work. And he writes to all his employers in Hoyland and Elsica and Wentworth and says to them, if I see you at any Chartist meeting, I will dismiss you straight away. And this letter is... And he sends spies again to meetings to send in reports of who's there. And Earl Fitzwilliam sends people to look round these Chartist meetings because there's a big one at Hood Hill. I think it's 1842. And there's letters coming into the fifth Earl Fitzwilliam about exactly which of his miners are there, and he sacks them.
Anything else anybody would like to ask or comment on? Yes.
Were the striking miners living in houses owned by the mine owners?
Yes, so it's not... Yes, so there would have been tied houses. There are evictions, so Middleton up in Leeds, in 1800, they have definitely got tied houses because there was a strike at Middleton Colliery in 1800. Actually, it starts where the miners march into Leeds Marketplace with a loaf dipped in pig's blood on a stick and demanding bread or blood. They've got a banner with them that says bread or blood. And the miners who are in that strike are evicted from their tied cottages, yes. It's certainly happening in the North East. Lord Londonderry, he's, again, not a particularly nice guy. He evicts all of his miners in the 1830s and 1840s. But it's quite unclear in Yorkshire which coal owners, because of the survival of papers, are evicting miners. But my interpretation is yes, it would have definitely happened. Definitely.
Thank you. Anything else anybody would like to ask or say? Peter, can I ask Peter first? Yeah. Peter?
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk some insurrectionists from Barnsley.
Yes.
They had to progress and were eventually dispersed.
Yeah.
I read in Berlin's annals that
Yes.
you also mentioned that they stopped off at a colliery not too far away from here to collect firearms. Is that at all right that they would be given firearms?
I have heard that, and I don't know whether they were given them. My impression of reading the lieutenancy papers is that actually they were going into people's houses and taking them. And everyone, they take all these firearms, and they're definitely carrying pikes, and they're carrying Peterloo banners, or banners that they made in response to the Peterloo massacre in 1819. So they carry banners that say Hunt and Liberty along with pikes and firearms. But I don't know that exact example of them getting anything from the colliers. There's no collies, as far as I'm aware, involved in Grangemore. Everyone takes a firearm or a pipe apart from someone called Thomas Farrimond, who's kind of the leader of Barnsley radicalism in the early 19th century. He's a really interesting character, actually. He doesn't take any firearms. He just takes pen and paper, quill and loads of paper with him because he's expected to be the secretary of the provisional government. So he doesn't take anything with him apart from paper, Thomas Farrimond. But it's interesting because we're going back to Chartism. So some of the ones who were involved in Grangemore, Valence, I can't remember his first name, he comes back after it's been transported to Van Diemen's Land and becomes a committed Barnsley Chartist, and he signs in the 1830s something called the Manifesto for the Barnsley Chartists, and his name's on it, having been at Grangemore in 1819, 1820. So that in the sense there is this continuity of radicalism in Barnsley from the 1810s through to the 1840s. And all of these are mostly linen weavers, actually.
Joe, it shows you how the government were on back foot then, didn't it? Back to the...
They were absolutely petrified, yeah. Because obviously you've got the French Revolution, 20 odd years before, they are absolutely petrified, yeah.
Well, that's why they suppressed the Peter Law.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Obviously, any uprising, any shape, way, or form, would suppress.
Yeah.
That's why they were sending spies or infiltrating different types of radical meetings. And then Ferguson O'Connor from that scene, and other Chartist people, you're aware of.
Yeah.
William Coffey.
Yeah.
He was transport Van Diemen's Land.
Yeah.
He was a dark person.
Yeah.
When he could come back to this country after he served his penal servitude, he couldn't afford shit to come back, could he?
No. So he stays there.
He sent his wife, public appeal for government, sent his wife over to Van Diemen's Land to be with him. And I believe his son was still in Van Diemen's Land to this day.
Right.
Because they were a radical in Van Diemen's Land, who looked at the
That's right, yeah. And it's interesting when you look at the Grangemore weavers, because all of them were literate, quite articulate men who could read and could debate politics. All of them in Van Diemen's Land end up with quite good jobs in the government there because they are able to read and write and they're able to discuss and debate things. So all the radicals, a lot of the Barnsley radicals who get transported to Van Diemen's Land do end up having, once they've served their penal servitude, getting reasonably good, quite well paid jobs in early days of Tasmania, yeah.
This is a genuine question, I'm not a plant.
This is Joe's wife.
Yeah, I am genuinely asking. Did political radicalism have any divisive impact on the Yorkshire miners, like those who were more loyal and then those who became further down the line like Chartists? Was there tensions within the community between loyalists and radicals?
Yes, there was.
Can anybody hear that question? Yes,
So
oh, no, someone shaking their head. Do you want to just stand up and ask?
Yeah, I was just asking if political radicalism had a divisive impact within the mining community, between sort of was there tension between loyalists and then the political radicals as radicalism kind of came to the Yorkshire miners later on?
Yes, but I can't give you any specific examples because I can't remember. But yes, there is. There is discussions about. And even in this paper, when they're singing "God Save the King" and "Rule Britannia," some historians would say, "Oh, well, that's just a way of essentially we're on strike, we're breaking the law through forming a combination, but we're going to sing these patriotic songs. Maybe it's kind of two fingers up to the government that we're able to do this." Amid your repressive laws to stop the formation of unions. The combination laws get repealed in 1824 and 25, and you see a massive upsurge then of people forming unions. I mean, it doesn't really stop them, to be fair, as we've seen, because they just do it kind of covertly or through friendly societies. Friendly societies are a good way for people, because they say, oh, it's a benefit club if you get killed underground. You pay threepence a week for people to pay for your funeral, but actually it's not a burial club, it's a trade union. There's some from Darton actually in the British Library, a Darton Collieries Club, which is meant to be a burial club for miners at work, and it's not, it's essentially a covert trade union. But by the 1820s, 1824, 25, you do get this kind of outpouring of unions which have previously been underground and now able to organise on a bigger scale because they're no longer illegal.
Yes, Victor.
Could I just take you back to an earlier period in 1807 or possibly 1809? A strike in the Huddersfield area at Colway, in which the strikers were dealt with on behalf of the owner by the master, the manager of the house. But when it was settled, it was the master that had to leave.
Oh, right.
Because the workforce refused to operate under him, which is why he came to Barnsley and was manager here. So I don't know if there are any other examples of that sort of thing happening.
It's interesting how Fitzwilliam tends to send his steward, or tends to claim that when he's discussing things with the miners, especially in the 1850s, going further into the 19th century, he tends to kind of say, oh, I'm a bit aloof from this. It's my steward who's making the decisions on the wages, even though he's in all the correspondence with him. But no, that's an interesting one. I'll have to find out more about that because I don't think I've come across that one. So in Huddersfield in 1809, so I'll have to...
There is a link with my earlier question because William Locke, who was manager in Huddersfield, moved to Barnsley as a result of that. When the manager of the mine in Barnsley actually died, so it took his place.
Joe, I heard what input did church have on this action? Did they have any input?
So most of... It's a bit difficult... It's quite difficult to prove because a lot of the miners would have been Methodists because Methodism was just so strong in the West Riding in this period, particularly up in the Huddersfield and Wakefield areas. So a lot of them would have been Methodists, but whether they were primitive Methodists is not entirely clear because primitive Methodism is generally seen, particularly in the North East, as kind of the... So a lot of miners emerge, a lot of unions emerge out of primitive Methodism because primitive Methodism gives people the ability to write and to read and to discuss things. But I think a lot of them would have been Wesleyans. Obviously a few of them would have been members of the established church. Everyone had to get married in an established church, so we can't really track them getting married as Methodists. But there's Tankersley. There are definite miners who have traced through, because there was Tommy shops, truck shops, where miners would be paid rather in coin, in tokens or in goods for their work. At Tankersley, Mortonley Colliery, they would be paid in kind of like bacon and things like that, or beer often, as was the case, like navvies. And they were definitely primitive Methodists because the owners, Newton and Chambers, were Methodists as well. And they had a big thing on getting the miners involved in their chapel as well. So to answer your question, Steve, it's not clear, but I think a lot of them would have been Methodists.
There would have been some input.
Yeah.
Especially Rampas.
Oh yeah, primitive method. Yeah. And a lot of the coal owners were clerical magistrates as well. So Reverend Wood, who has his road court and things like that, was a magistrate, was also a coal owner. You do get that, as within Manchester in the factory district, you do get factory owners who are magistrates. There's nothing unusual in that, and who are also clerics.
I think we'll find when the Poland hit open to this country at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Anything else, Al? While we've still got this absolute encyclopedia knowledge here. Anything else? Well, I just have to say, when's your book coming out?
Oh no.
My gosh, the amount of research that you've done, I suppose it would be not just one book, would it? There'd be several emerging.
And there's still so much to find out. Like, there's stuff appearing all the time.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Because it's such, it feels to me, listening to you certainly, that it's such an under-researched area of our history, in our country. And wow, I am just blown away by the amount of work that you've already done, but you're not finished. So I think we're very, very lucky to have had Joe here tonight, and his wife, who is supporting there. But thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and the work that you've done so far. And best of luck ongoing. Maybe we'll get you back in a couple of years' time and see what else you've found out that you can share with us. So a big thank you again to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I would also have to say a big thank you to the Miners Hall for having us here. What better place could we have had for this particular talk? So a big thank you. Really. And last of all, I would just like to say thank you for you as members if you've come along as members of the Barnsley Civic Trust. If you're not a member already and you'd like to keep connected with us, then do, as you go out, there will be somebody at the door who will help you sign up to the Barnsley Civic Trust if you'd like to join us in lots more interesting talks. Thank you very, very much for coming along tonight. Thank you for safe journey home. Thank you. Thank you.